conversation with Jesus. Jesus has tried to be plain and explain to them what's going to happen. I mean, there's no grid for this. There's no manual for this. This has never happened before. And so this is very confusing for the disciples. So where we're going to go next is we're going to talk about Jesus' time on the cross and what led up to that. So this is where we're transitioning into. Now, as we move into this time, how many of you have seen a picture similar to this? Seen a picture similar to this? Sure, maybe not this exact picture, but sometimes when we talk about Jesus on the cross, this might be the picture that you've seen, or even the picture that's in your mind. Well, I'm going to tell you that this is not how it looked. This is not the way it was. And we're going to talk today about what happened to Jesus from a medical perspective. We're going to talk about it, but we're also going to look at some stuff too. We're going to start in Luke 22. So we're going to look at the Passion. The Passion, we hear that term. Let's go back. That's a good point. We hear that term, the Passion of the Christ. It's a movie. It's a term that you hear this time of year. But passion doesn't mean what we might think it means, as far as, he loved us passionately, which he did. Passion in this context means suffering. So if you want to rename this the suffering, that's really accurate for what we're talking about here. So we're going to be looking at the suffering of Christ from a medical perspective. And we're going to start back at the Garden of Gethsemane, which is where they went shortly after they shared the meal. Jesus went out, as usual, to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, from a medical perspective, as we look at this, there's so much that we could pull out of this. But we're really going to focus, for our purposes today, really on the ending part about the sweat. And it's an actual medical condition called hematidrosis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it's caused by extreme emotional stress. Now, we've been under some stress before. We've been stressed. Has anyone been stressed to the point of sweating blood? Never happened? But it could happen. Physically, our bodies can do that. And that's what happened to Jesus. The capillaries in the sweat glands, so the parts of your body, the sweat glands, they actually break. And so what comes out is blood mixed with sweat. So at this point, Jesus is literally sweating blood. But look what happened just before that. An angel appeared from heaven and strengthened him. An angel just came and strengthened him, but still, all of this is on Jesus. From an emotional, weighty perspective, he starts to sweat. Blood mixed with sweat. The next section that we're going to look at here is when he goes before Pilate. Luke 23, 18 through 25. But the whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Barabbas had been thrown into prison for insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again. But they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And for the third time Pilate spoke. "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I will have him punished and then release him." But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant them their demand, and he released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, Barabbas, the one who they had asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. So So let's look at Mark 15. There's a verse right after this. It says this, wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. Now, nothing will happen. Let me preface that with that statement. But I do need a volunteer, preferably a male. You've already helped me. You've already helped me. Casey does not want to help me. Would you, kind sir, be willing to help me?
Kidding.
All right, now, you're not going to be up here that long, but here's what happened. So when they handed them over, it said, they handed them over to be crucified. The way it was said earlier is basically he let them have their will, what they wanted to do. And so the first thing they did is they stripped him of his clothes. And then after that, what they did is they took his hands. I'm going to have to turn around. And hands above your head. And they tied them together. There we go. To a post. I'm going to have you turn with your back to the group. To a post. So this is how he's tied. He's tied up like that. And so one of the guards took what was called a flagrum. And I think we have it here. Yes, this is a flagrum. Yeah, this is a flagrum. So it has a wooden handle and it has leather strips on it. And at the end of the leather strips are actually hard steel metal balls. And some of them had pieces of bone. And so remember, there's nothing on Jesus at this time. And they would take that and they would whip it across his back. Now, in the very beginning, what would happen is he would have deep bruises, especially from the iron balls. But after that, they would continue, and they wouldn't just hit him in the shoulder area. They would hit him in his back, they would hit him down to his legs, all through here. From here to here, they were striking him with the flagrum. Over and over and over. You can put your arms down. You can stay there. And so they would do this until the point when he was almost dead. They didn't want to kill him, but they would do this. I need to stand. Thank you. No, you're good. You're fine. So they would do this until he was almost dead. And it said, when you read this, that his back looked like this. His skin looked like this. Ribbons. It wasn't whole anymore. It was like ribbons of flesh on his back. Why do you think they had his hands tied up the whole time? What?
So he couldn't get out.
Yeah, so he wouldn't move. Exactly right. So he wouldn't move. So they had his hands tied up like that, so he wouldn't move. At this point, he was already unrecognizable. Unrecognizable, just mass of flesh. When he was near bleeding, they stopped. They cut him down. What do you think happened the moment they cut his hands off? Or cut his hands down from the post? Yeah, he fell. Go ahead. Yeah, I mean, he just slumped. He just crumbled to the ground. Thank you for your help. Yeah, he crumbled to the ground. But they weren't done. They were just getting started. So, at this point, for most people that's enough. But it's like, you know what? We're going to tease him now. And so they teased him about being a king. So what are some things that a king might wear? Think of it. Think for a second. Lydia, what's one thing a king might wear? Crown. What's something else a king might wear? A robe. Yeah, royal clothes, maybe a robe. What is the thing, adults, that a king might have in his hand? Scepter, right, a scepter. So that's what they did. They dressed him up, and they had a robe on him, and they had this. Let's take a look at our passage here in Matthew. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him, and they stripped him. Oh, let's talk about that. So after they had done all this, they put some clothes back on him. So if his back was almost unrecognizable in ribbons, when you put clothes back onto that, what are those clothes going to do?
It's gonna hurt.
Yet, what are those clothes going to do with the body? stick. They're going to stick. It's going to be sort of like a Band-Aid almost. I mean, it's adhere really good, really well. So when they did that, it said they stripped him. Now, they didn't just come up to his back and, oh, God, I know this is going to hurt. No. Stripped him of his clothes. So what did that do to his back all over again? And this is participatory. You guys can actually talk. What did it do to his back again? Ripped it open. Exactly. They put a scarlet robe on him. So here we go again. It's gonna adhere again to his body. And they twisted together a crown of thorns and they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they knelt down before him and they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and they took the reed and they began to beat him on the head. And after they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off of him and put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him. We're going to break this down a little bit. Let's take a look at the next picture. This is called a spina Christi. This is a plant or a bush actually that grew in the area where Jesus was at, and it was very pliable, it was very bendable, and so they cut a piece of this off, and they bent it, and they formed a crown. Now look at those thorns. How long do you think those are? Just take a guess. Yeah, maybe 2 inches. 2 inches. So they formed this, they put it together, and then what did it say that they did with the crown? Placed it on his head. Right. Now we can think of placed it on his head as one thing, but I don't think they just placed it on his head. I think they placed it on his head. Now, the head, from a medical perspective, the head is the most vascular part of our body. What that means is, you get a cut on your head, what's going to happen? You're going to bleed, and you're going to bleed a lot. Not like a cut on your finger, not like a cut on your arm. You get a cut on your head, and it's going to bleed. Now imagine if you had those thorns stuck in your head. Now it's not, again, not going into the brain. You've got your head, you've got your skull here, brain's underneath. But yeah, it's very vascular. So he's going to be bleeding. He's going to be bleeding like crazy at this point. Also, the head has the greatest amount of nerves. So that means that the nerves are the things that send the messages to the brain about pain. They couldn't have chosen a more painful place to hurt Jesus than to put this crown on his head, because not only is he bleeding profusely, but messages of pain are going to his brain like crazy. Now, if we go back to the passage, one moment, it said they had a reed in his right hand. Hail, King of the Jews. Verse 30, they spat on him and they took the reed and they did what with it? Beat him on the head. So he's already got this crown on his head. Next slide with the picture. Thank you. They've already got that, but they're taking this and they're whacking him on the head. So it's just driving it more and more and more into his head. It also says at the end of that passage that they took the robe off of his back again. So here we go. Ripping the robe off of his back. And they returned his clothes to him. Now, this was really to be considerate of the Jews, because normally this wouldn't happen. Normally they don't return their clothes to them, but in this case, in deference to the Jews, they let him have his clothes back. So they did. So then, let's move on. Luke 23:26. When they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, coming in from the country, and placed on him the cross to carry behind Jesus. Now, let's talk a little bit about the cross. Normally, you might see a picture, in paintings or things of the big cross, and it's over Jesus' shoulder, and he's walking like this. Have anybody ever seen the picture before like that? Okay, not accurate. Just letting you know, not accurate. Here's what it looked like. What it did is they took this crossbar. It's called a patibulum. Now, who weightlifts in here? Anybody lift? You lift? That's so cool. You lift? All right, you lift. So for those of you who lift, if you had to lift 80 to 110 pounds, is that possible? Okay, for some people, yes. Some people, no, depending on who you are, depending on your body. This, and for you, lifting 80 to 110 pounds, is that a big deal? No, not really. Not really. But this is 80 to 110 pounds. It's like, okay, what's the big deal? Well, let's review. What is his physical state right now? I mean, he's got all of these things that just happened to him. So they've taken this patibulum, this crossbar, like you can see in both pictures, and they put it up on his shoulders, and they actually tied his arms to it, much like what you see here. They tied his arms to it. And so the procession that we see was Jesus. There were two thieves, the executioners. So we have this procession of people, and they traveled down a road in Jerusalem, and it's called the Via Dolorosa, and it means the way of grief or the way of suffering. So they were to travel down this road, and the length from where they started to where they were going to go is about a third of a mile. So again, how many walkers do we have here? Anybody walk, run, runners, walkers, anything? Okay, so Jason, when you're doing good and you're kind of in the groove and you've been doing this for a couple weeks straight, what mileage do you usually go?
10-minute mile.
You can do a 10-minute mile?
You mean like distance?
What distance do you go? At least 3 miles. So a third of a mile for you? Nothing. Really not that hard. I'm not worried about speed, just endurance. You can do a third of a mile. If we're thinking about it on a track, that would be about 1.5 laps around a track. So if you want to think of it that way in terms of distance, so we're talking. And so for us to do that, normally no big deal. But if we look at what happened to Jesus, 80 to 110 pound, long, huge patibulum on his shoulder, now he's going to do this for a third of a mile. How far do you think he got?
An inch, maybe.
Yeah, a couple steps if he's lucky. And then what happened? Yeah, fell over big time. I mean, it's weighty, and he probably, he's top heavy, and so I'm sure he just went over backwards. And as it said, they found a man in the crowd named Simon of Cyrene. It's a place, it says from research that he was a large North African man to carry the cross. And so they put the patibulum on Simon to do this. And Jesus, I mean, he didn't get a pass. He didn't have to carry anything, but he still had to go. So he's got to walk behind. He's processing with this group. And at this point, he's most likely in shock. I mean, his body, with the blood loss, with everything it's been through, he is physically in shock. So they're proceeding to the next point, the crucifixion. John 19, 17, and 18. They took Jesus to the place of the skull. That's what Golgotha means, place of the skull, which is called Golgotha. And there they crucified him. So history shows that they stripped him of his clothes and they left a loincloth. Again, this was in deference to the Jews. The Jews allowed this. This wasn't always the case with most people crucified. So they stripped him of his clothes again. They left a loincloth. And the first thing they did is they offered him a drink. Now, this wasn't with a cup. This was likely in a sponge or something, and they held it up. And Jesus, he's not up on the cross yet. My apologies. They've arrived. They offer him a drink, and he refuses. And the drink is actually wine mixed with myrrh. Now, I find it interesting that it's myrrh, because where else do we find myrrh in the story of Jesus? His birth. So we find myrrh at the very beginning and the very end of Jesus' life. And when you mix the water and the myrrh, it created an actual kind of pain reliever. It would actually relieve the pain, but Jesus refused. He said, "No, I'm not gonna take this." So Simon put the patibulum down on the ground, and what they did with Jesus is they didn't carefully lay him down. They took him and they threw him down on it. They threw him down on this wood. So he's in shock anyway. They throw him down. His back is against this wood, and his shoulders are against it. So we're gonna take this and talk through two different parts: the hands and the feet. Now, people talk about, well, he wasn't crucified in his hands; he was crucified in his wrists. So I had that question too, so I looked it up. He actually was crucified in his hands, but from a medical perspective, from here up is considered your hand. So this is still considered part of your hand. The pictures that you see of Jesus being crucified through here, it's impossible. It wouldn't happen. Because if you're hanging like that, it's going to rip out. It's going to rip through. That's not even possible. So what actually happened was they used the wrist. So I want you to take your hand, put it out, and feel with your thumb. There should be kind of like a little indentation or a little impression in your wrist. Are you able to find that? Okay. You've got two bones there called the ulna and the radius, and that is where they put the nails. Now, I brought some. I'm not sure that this is exactly what they're like, and please be careful with these. They're not sharp, but they're still nails. So hand these around. Take a look at them. Maybe this is the kind of thing that would have been similar to what they used. So it said that they used a heavy wrought iron nail. That's the best that I could come up with. Now, so they found that place, and that's where they nailed it, right into the patibulum, into that wood. Now, when they did it, they didn't stretch his arms out like this. Jesus' arms were not like this. Jesus' arms were probably more about like this. He needed some flexibility in his arms, and we'll get to why that was necessary in a minute. So it was about like this that he had. So his hands are nailed in that position. And then what they did from there is they lifted the patibulum up on top of the wooden stake forming a cross. So that's where we get the picture. Now, did it sit directly on top like this? Did it come through a little bit like this? I don't know. My guess is it was more of a T. But it was set up like that. So he's hanging there now, arms bent about like this. So they take his feet, and I'm going to have you do this. Go ahead and take your shoes off.
Okay.
Now, what I'm going to have you do is take one foot. It's going to be easier sitting than me standing. Put the other one right on top of the other foot. So right on top of the other foot. And if you had one of those spikes, they'd be using that again, because they're going to take that and they're going to drive it right through the arch. It's going to come out. It's going to go into the top of the arch. It's going to come out the other arch. So they were like this through the arch. Now, again, he wasn't upright. His knees were probably bent. So if I were able to stand like that, it would be something like that. So he's like that. His arms are kind of like that. If you want to put your shoes back on, feel free. So the nail was driven through each arch, and the knees were moderately flexed. So now, technically, the person is crucified. That's what crucified means. So let's talk about Jesus' time actually on the cross itself. Now, let's go back to the wrists. Anybody here ever had carpal tunnel? Okay. Connie, you've had carpal tunnel. You've had surgery for it as well. Prior to having the surgery, what would aggravate your carpal tunnel? Okay, so typing, something like that. And what did it feel like? Numb? Was there any pain with it? Okay, stinging, needles, pain, things like that. And the reason I asked that about carpal tunnel is because the nerve right there is called the median nerve. And that is the nerve that got severed. And this would be like carpal tunnel to the nth degree for him to have that. So he's got that in both wrists while he's hanging there. And so the only way that he could relieve pressure on the wrists was probably to do what? Push up with his feet. Push up with his feet. But when he pushed up with his feet, now where's all the pain? It's in his feet. It's not like the pain here has gone away, but all of the pain is in the feet. So, anybody ever had cramps before? Like in your muscles? Yeah. Kim, what does it feel like when you have a muscle cramp?
Super tight, mega pain.
Right. If somebody came up and squeezed that muscle, squeezed your leg as hard as they could and held it tight, that would kind of be the pain that would happen with a cramp. And that's what was starting to happen at this point. Cramps would set in, and when that happened, I mean, he's not able to push himself up anymore. He's not able to do that movement up and down to get any kind of relief. So what happens is the large muscles in the chest are paralyzed. And the small muscles in between the ribs, they're unable to work either. So the large muscles in the chest, little ones in between the ribs, can't work. And as a result, you can breathe in, but you can't exhale. Now, breathing in all the time, it's not going to do anything for me if I can't let it out. So if you breathe in a whole lot, what's getting inside your lungs?
A lot of bacteria.
And from a chemical standpoint, what's that called? Carbon dioxide. So you've got carbon dioxide building up inside of his lungs and in his bloodstream. And now, the thing about it is, when that started to happen so much, the cramps actually subsided a little bit. Because he was having this buildup of carbon dioxide, his cramps started to go down a little bit. So, really what's happening is he's only able to do things in short bursts. So, imagine. And he's So this is the kind of action that's going on and on, as much as he can push up and release. But then we find out that while he's in this position, Jesus says 7 things. Now, it's possible that a Good Friday service or someplace you've heard about the 7 last words of Christ. Maybe you've heard that before. I'm not so worried about learning what those things meant as how those things felt. If all you can do is gasp and get just a little bit of air, if you wanted to say 7 things, they would be 7 things, the most 7 important things that you wanted to say. So let's look at what happened, and even maybe how it would have sounded. The first thing, Jesus is on the cross, and you'll remember that they ripped off his garments, and the guards are down here gambling for his clothes. Jesus has 7 things to say. The first thing that he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. First one. It wasn't, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Not at all. There's no way he could have done that. It had to have been something like that. The second one, there's a thief on the cross, and he begins to have a conversation with Jesus. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Today you will be with me in paradise. One of the 7 words that he chose was a word of life that he gave to someone else. As Jesus looked down, he saw his mother, Mary, he saw John. You can imagine what they were going through. People all around still mocking, still yelling. Some people probably throwing up from the situation because they're so troubled. So Jesus looks down, and then compassion. Woman, behold your son. Behold your mother. He's comforting. Jesus. Imagine what he's going through right now. It's comforting. His mother and what the Bible says, the apostle whom Jesus loved, John. He's providing comfort at this point. It's fourth word. My God, why have you forsaken me? Quite a thing to say as one of your 7 last words. So let's remember where we're at. Jesus has already sweat blood. He's already been scourged, beaten, where his body is in ribbons. He's had clothes repeatedly put on and ripped off, opening wounds. He's been made to carry a cross that he couldn't carry at all. He's crucified in his hands and his feet, and every time he goes up and down, that wood behind him isn't smooth. That wood behind him is scraping his back both ways. Up and down, scrape. Up and down, scraping his back, clear from his leg, his rear, through his neck. He has searing pain. He's suffering from partial asphyxiation. Then we run into another problem. It's a medical term that has to do with pericardium. Let me explain this. It's a crushing pain in your chest, and in your heart, there's actually a sac that's around the outside of your heart, and it's called the pericardium. And that sac is slowly starting to fill with serum. What's serum? Well, it's probably a mixture of blood that's not pumping and other fluids in his body. It's starting to fill up around his heart. And what it's starting to do is it's starting to compress his heart. Now, at this point, we actually miraculously see prophecy fulfilled. Psalm 22:14, psalmist writes, I am poured out like water, and my bones are all out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within me. This is a reference to what Christ is going through on the cross. Back when this was written, they had no cognitive knowledge that this was going to happen, yet it was foretelling what happened to Christ. At this point, the end is very near. As he hangs, pushes up, continues to try and breathe, the blood is just like sludge. That compression is getting tighter and tighter and tighter. He can only inhale in small gulps at this point. Very small gulps of air. Which is why we come to the fifth word, because what's happening to the tissue in his body is they're becoming dehydrated. They're lacking all fluid at this point, and so Jesus comes to his fifth word. I thirst. This time he took the drink. What they did is they took a sponge, they put it in here, and they put it up to give him a drink. Does anybody want to, this is totally clean, the sponge is brand new, I haven't done anything to the liquid. Does anybody want to come up and just at least smell this? Yeah, come on up. You can smell it. Something you want to drink? No? Here. Yeah. You trust me. Okay. So yeah. Anybody else want to just smell it? You want to smell it? Is that something you'd want to drink? You want to smell it?
It smells like vinegar.
Ah.
It smells like vinegar.
Yeah. Right you are. It was something very similar to this. Like water mixed with vinegar. Want to smell it? It'll clean out your sinuses. Yeah, smell it. You can smell it? You can smell it from there, probably. So, I mean, imagine this foul-smelling liquid, and this is what they gave him to drink. I thirst. They gave him that to drink. At this point, he gets to the sixth word. It is finished. Finally, his body is allowed to die. Finally, his body is allowed to die. He takes one more push, takes even deeper a breath, and finishes with this. Father, into your hands, I commit my spirit. And with those words, Jesus died. Now, death by crucifixion usually took several days. I mean, imagine, people who are normally crucified, they may have not gone through the beating part. Jesus was, if you think about it in terms of the physical, Jesus was probably done a little bit of a favor. Because if you hadn't gone through the beating part, you'd have a lot more strength to be able to do this and get a breath. I mean, imagine doing that for days. Crucifixions went on for days. This didn't take nearly that long. So there was something that they did to speed up crucifixions. And that was to break the legs of those who are on the cross. So why would that speed up crucifixion if the legs were broken? Yeah, because you wouldn't be able to push up anymore. No more pushing up means, everything that we talked about. All you can do is inhale. You're filled with carbon dioxide. Things, yes, you suffocate. That's exactly what happens. But because of the scourging, the death came much quicker. And while some things say that the suffocation may have been caused of death, the one that the portion that I studied said that actually it was probably because of the pressure on his heart from the pericardium that kept squeezing and squeezing, and eventually his heart went out of rhythm and it stopped. So when the soldiers approached Jesus, he was dead, and there was no need to break his legs. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first man and of the other who was crucified with him. But coming to Jesus, when they saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. Come back up. Trust me, I'm not going to do this to you. So what happened was, he's hanging on the cross. The spear would have come in through the ribs, up in, and pierced that pericardium sac where his heart is at. So you've got this line right here. So that's why you have the blood and the water that flowed, because he's got all that stuff in that sac, plus the blood that flew out of his body. So Jesus has died, and we're not going to go into the taking down of the body and those things, because that's for next week. But I really want us to dwell on this, and I want us to consider this. Christ went through this for me. So what is my response? Christ went through everything that we talked about for each one of us. So what is my response? We're going to end with a time of worship and just a time of really thinking and considering that question.